The contract folder felt heavy in Fila's hands, heavier than paper and ink had any right to feel. She'd secured the next core deal through sheer determination, countless sleepless nights and sacrifices that had carved pieces from her soul. Her grandmother's ruby necklace, the one that had survived 3 generations, passed from strong woman to strong woman, now belonged to a pawnshop owner who barely looked at her while counting cash with calloused fingers. Her Mercedes, the car she'd bought herself before the marriage turned into quicksand, sold to a teenager whose father paid in crisp hundreds that smelled like new money and her old freedom. Every piece of herself traded away to save Simon's failing company, to prove that their love meant fighting through impossible odds, to demonstrate that marriage was about sacrifice and endurance. The automatic doors of the luxury shopping complex whispered open with a pneumatic sigh, and time fractured into before and after. Simon stood beneath the crystal chandelier, its 1,000 glittering pieces casting fractured light across the marble floor, his arms wrapped around Isabella from accounting. Not a friendly hug, not a consolation embrace, not a professional gesture misread by distance. His hands splayed across her lower back with the familiarity of repeated practice, fingers pressing into fabric like they knew exactly where to rest. Their bodies fitted together like puzzle pieces that had found each other in secret 1,000 times before Isabella's head rested on his chest, exactly where Fila's used to rest. Back when she still believed his heartbeat meant something true, when the rhythm against her ear had felt like home instead of betrayal's percussion. The folder slipped an inch in her grip. The next core contract, 100 million in revenue, the salvation of everything she'd bled for, the proof that her strategy worked even when everyone doubted, suddenly weighed nothing at all. Isabella saw her first. Her eyes widened with the shock of someone caught mid-crime, and she whispered something against Simon's collar, her lips moving against the expensive fabric Fila had helped him select last month. He turned, and Fila watched every drop of blood drain from his face until he looked like a ghost wearing her husband's expensive suit, his skin taking on the greyish pallor of a man facing consequences he'd convinced himself would never arrive. The marble floor stretched between them like an ocean, like miles of impossible distance, like the actual space that had existed in their marriage, while Fila fooled herself into believing proximity meant intimacy. Shoppers flowed around the tableau, unaware they were witnessing the precise moment a woman's heart stopped believing in second chances, stopped making excuses, stopped translating his failures into her responsibilities. Isabella's voice came out small and uncertain, a question that held no real curiosity, just the hollow politeness of someone hoping social convention might smooth over catastrophe. "Is she your ex?" Fila's response cut through the air with surgical precision, each word chosen for maximum clarity and minimum emotion. "No, I'm the current wife, but thank you for showing me who's going to be his next ex." She didn't wait for the shock to register fully on their faces, didn't give Simon the satisfaction of seeing tears or hearing accusations or witnessing the collapse she felt happening inside her chest cavity where her heart had apparently been storing up rage for years. She turned on her heel and walked toward the banking center on the 3rd floor, her footsteps steady despite the earthquake happening inside her chest, despite her hands starting to tremble now that adrenaline was flooding her system. The banking representative looked up with a professional smile that faltered when she saw Fila's expression. Whatever her face showed, it was enough to make the representative straighten immediately, concern replacing practiced warmth. "I need to freeze every joint account under my name immediately, every credit card attached to my husband, everything." Her voice didn't shake, hands didn't tremble where the representative could see them. She'd spent the last 2 years holding herself together through impossible pressure. She could hold herself together through this too. She'd perfected the art of functioning while dying inside. 12 minutes later, every account was locked, every credit line suspended, every financial connection severed with the efficiency of someone who'd been preparing for this moment without consciously knowing it. The next core contract, signed under her maiden name because she'd been rebuilding her professional reputation after Simon's failures had tarnished it, went into her personal safety deposit box alongside the only jewelry she hadn't sold, her mother's wedding band, which she now slid off her finger and placed in the cold metal drawer with hands that had finally started shaking. Simon's calls started before she reached the parking garage, 23 missed calls by the time she slid into her rental sedan, the cheap car that smelled like air freshener and strangers, so different from the Mercedes she'd sacrificed. She answered once, her voice calm as winter morning, cold as the truth that had just rearranged her entire understanding of the last 7 years. "The company you were about to lose? I just saved it. The wife who saved it? You just lost her." She dropped the phone out the window. It shattered against the highway asphalt, pieces scattering like the fragments of everything she'd believed about their marriage, about his love, about her worth in his eyes. The wind whipped through the open window and Fila realized she was smiling. Not from joy, not from satisfaction, from the savage relief of finally knowing the truth instead of drowning in suspicion and self-doubt and wondering if she was crazy for noticing all the small betrayals that preceded this enormous one. Her apartment, the small place she'd kept in her name alone, the refuge she'd never mentioned to Simon because some part of her had always known to keep an exit route, waited in the quiet neighborhood across town. She'd paid the rent through her separate account, the one he didn't know existed, the one she'd fed with freelance work done at midnight after he'd fallen asleep, insurance she'd bought without admitting to herself why she needed insurance against her own marriage. Inside, she locked the door and slid down against it, the contract folder still clutched against her chest like armor that hadn't quite protected her heart. The sobs came then, wrenching and ugly, the kind of crying that leaves you hollow afterward, that empties you out completely. She cried for the woman who'd sold her grandmother's necklace, believing it would save their future. Cried for the wife who'd worked 18-hour days thinking her sacrifice proved love. Cried for every moment she'd chosen to trust him when her instincts had whispered warnings she'd been too devoted to hear, too committed to acknowledge. When the tears stopped, Fila stood and walked to the bathroom mirror. Her eyes were swollen, mascara tracked down her cheeks in ugly streaks, but beneath the wreckage she saw something she hadn't seen in years. Herself, not Simon's wife. Not the woman breaking herself in half to hold his world together, just Fila Kumalo, the brilliant strategist who'd been buried under someone else's needs for far too long. She washed her face with cold water that shocked her skin into numbness, scrubbed away the makeup and the tears and the last remnants of the woman who'd walked into that shopping complex believing her marriage was solid. Then she opened her laptop. The Nextcore contract was hers. Every clause, every negotiation, every innovative solution that had won them over bore her fingerprints, her vision, her expertise. Simon had been the salesman who smiled in meetings, who charmed executives with surface-level understanding. She'd been the architect who actually built what was promised, who delivered beyond expectations. Her phone, the new one she'd activated on the drive home, buzzed with an email from her attorney, the one she'd quietly retained 3 weeks ago when she'd first suspected Simon's late nights weren't about deadlines. The message was brief. "Received your documentation. Everything is ready when you are." Fila hit reply and typed 3 words. "I'm ready now." Outside her window, the city lights flickered on as dusk settled into darkness. Somewhere across town, Simon was probably panicking, discovering that his access to everything had been severed, that the foundation of his entire professional existence had walked out of his life in the time it took for automatic doors to open and close. She didn't feel guilty, didn't feel vindictive. She felt awake. The contract folder sat on her desk, And Fila opened it one more time, reading through the terms she'd negotiated with brilliance he'd never possessed. This wasn't his second chance. This was her first one. The first opportunity to build something that belonged entirely to her, untainted by his mediocrity and betrayal. Her reflection in the darkened window showed a woman standing taller than she had in years. The automatic doors had opened on the truth. Now every other door was hers to walk through alone. Chapter 2. Surgical Extraction. The movers arrived at dawn, their truck idling in the driveway like a getaway vehicle, exhaust creating ghostly clouds in the cold morning air. Fila had orchestrated this with the precision of a military operation. Every item catalogued during sleepless nights, every belonging sorted into hers and his with clinical detachment. She'd taken nothing that predated their marriage, nothing he could claim in court, nothing that would give him ammunition to paint her as vindictive or grasping, just her clothes, her books, her grandmother's quilt that had covered their bed but had never really been his, and the laptop that contained years of work he'd presented as collaborative but was entirely hers. Every line of code, every strategic framework, every innovation that had kept his company from drowning. Simon wasn't supposed to be back until evening. He'd texted, before she'd blocked him, about a trip upstate to meet with potential investors. She knew now it was probably Isabella's family reunion, another weekend of playing pretend, while Fila drowned in spreadsheets and strategy, another 48 hours of him building a parallel life she'd been too exhausted to notice. But plans shifted like sand, and Simon's car pulled up just as the movers were loading the last boxes into the truck's cavernous interior. He stumbled out, still wearing yesterday's shirt with wrinkles that suggested he'd slept in it, hair uncombed and sticking up at odd angles, eyes wild with panic and sleeplessness. "Fila, wait, just wait. We can talk about this." She didn't pause, didn't acknowledge him, just kept directing the movers with calm efficiency. The head mover glanced between them, clearly accustomed to domestic drama accompanying his work, his face carefully neutral. "Everything you invested I'll pay back," Simon continued, his voice climbing desperately, cracking on certain syllables. "Every penny. The necklace money, the car, everything. Just don't do this, please." Fila finally turned to face him. "You can't pay back what you never valued." A sedan pulled up behind the moving truck, sleek and professional. Her attorney stepped out, briefcase in hand, expression professionally neutral, but eyes sharp with understanding. Simon's face shifted from desperate to defeated as he recognized what her presence meant, as he understood this wasn't impulsive rage, but calculated exit. "Mr. Harmer," the attorney said smoothly, voice carrying the authority of someone used to controlling difficult situations. "My client wishes to clarify some business matters. The next core contract was negotiated and secured entirely through Ms. Kumalo's professional relationships and expertise. All documentation supporting this has been compiled. Any attempt to claim ownership will be met with comprehensive legal response." Simon's mouth opened, closed, opened again, like a fish drowning in air. "The company is half yours, Fila. We built it together." "You're right that it's half mine," she replied evenly, her voice steady, despite the rage simmering beneath her composure. "Which is why I'm taking my half and leaving you with yours. The difference is, my half was the foundation. Yours was the paint." Her attorney handed him a folder, thick with legal documentation. "Dissolution of business partnership. Your signature acknowledging Ms. Kumalo's sole ownership of all intellectual property she developed, all client relationships she established, and all contracts she negotiated in exchange. You retain full ownership of the company name and physical assets." Simon flipped through the pages, his hands shaking so badly the paper rattled. "This leaves me with nothing. The clients all came through you. The solutions were your designs. You're gutting everything." "I'm taking what I built," Fila corrected, her tone almost gentle, which somehow made the words cut deeper. What's left is what you actually contributed. If that feels like nothing, perhaps that tells you something you should have learned years ago. He looked up at her, tears streaming now, all pretense of composure shattered like the phone she'd thrown on the highway. I love you. I made a mistake. One terrible mistake. Don't throw away 7 years over one mistake. It wasn't one mistake, Simon. It was 1,000 small betrayals that culminated in me seeing you hold another woman the way you promised to hold only me. Her voice remained steady, almost gentle, which somehow made the words cut deeper. But even that wasn't the real betrayal. The real betrayal was you spending 7 years taking credit for my work, while I convinced myself that partnership meant making you look good, that love meant hiding my light so you wouldn't feel dim by comparison. The movers were waiting by their truck, clearly uncomfortable, shifting weight from foot to foot. Fila nodded to them, and they closed the heavy doors with a metallic thud that sounded like finality. Simon tried one more approach, the one that used to work when they argued about his spending or his credit-taking, the one that had always made her soften, charm laced with vulnerability. Baby, I know I don't deserve you. I've known that since the day we met, but I've been trying every single day to become the man worthy of you. I failed. I know I failed, but give me another chance to try. Please. I gave you 7 years of chances, Fila said quietly, each word deliberate and final. I gave you my grandmother's necklace, my car, my credit, my sleep, my sanity, my belief in myself. You took all of it and spent it on looking successful, while I actually did the work of being successful, and when I was grinding myself into dust to save what I thought was ours, you were upstate with Isabella pretending I didn't exist. She walked toward her car, her attorney falling into step beside her like a bodyguard. Couples therapy, Simon shouted, desperation making his voice crack and rise to something almost feral. I'll do anything, any therapist you want, any schedule. I'll prove I've changed. I'll prove I can be what you need. Fila paused with her hand on the car door, her back still to him. For a moment something flickered across her face. Not hope, not forgiveness, but a flash of the woman who'd once loved him enough to bet everything on their future, who'd believed his promises were solid ground instead of quicksand. Then it passed like a cloud across the sun. You haven't changed, Simon. You've just run out of options. There's a difference. She looked back at him over her shoulder. You don't want to change. You want the consequences to disappear. The car door closed with a final click that echoed in the morning air. Through the window, she watched Simon collapse onto the front steps of the house they'd bought together, the house that still had 18 months of mortgage payments she'd been covering alone while he bought Isabella dinners and weekend getaways and whatever other small luxuries he'd justified as deserved. Her attorney slid into the passenger seat, settling her briefcase on her lap. He'll sign the papers. Men like him always do, once they realize their alternatives are worse. I don't care if he signs, Fila said, starting the engine, hands steady on the wheel. I have documentation for everything, every email showing my strategy, every client testimony about working with me specifically, every piece of intellectual property with my fingerprints. He can fight it if he wants. I'll still win. They drove in silence for several blocks before the attorney spoke again, her voice gentler now that they were away from the battlefield. Most people take longer to get here. The clarity, the ability to walk away without looking back. Fila kept her eyes on the road, watching traffic flow around her like water around stone. I didn't just get here. I've been getting here for 2 years. Every time I sold something precious to fund his dream. Every time I worked through the night while he slept. Every time I felt my intuition screaming warnings I refused to hear because I'd committed to making this marriage work no matter what it cost me. Her phone buzzed, the old one, the one she'd replaced, the one she'd kept active just to monitor his attempts at contact. 73 missed calls, 41 text messages. Every one a variation of desperation and promises she'd heard before, promises that had meant nothing when tested against his actual choices. At a red light, she powered it down completely and dropped it into her purse. That version of her life was over. That phone belonged to a woman who no longer existed. The new apartment waited, small but hers, paid for with money she'd earned, filled with space that belonged to no one's expectations but her own. And tomorrow, she'd start building something that Simon's mediocrity could never touch, could never claim, could never tarnish with his need to be important without doing important work. Chapter 3. Empire building begins. Fila's new office smelled like fresh paint and possibility, like new beginnings and clean slates. She'd chosen a modest suite in the professional district, nothing extravagant that would drain capital she needed for actual operations, just clean lines and large windows that let in morning light and made the space feel twice its actual size. The sign on the door read, "Cumulo Solutions," in understated gold lettering, elegant without being ostentatious, her maiden name reclaimed, her vision undiluted, her empire beginning. The next core contract became her anchor, her proof of concept, her validation that she could deliver excellence without Simon's name attached to it. They'd been thrilled to work directly with her, the actual strategist behind the proposals Simon had presented as joint efforts, while contributing nothing but his ability to smile convincingly in boardrooms. During their first official meeting without him, the Nextcore CEO had been remarkably candid, leaning back in his chair with visible relief. "We always knew the brilliance came from you, Ms. Cumulo. Your ex-husband was very good at PowerPoint presentations. You were the one who understood our actual needs." She assembled a small team, 3 brilliant minds she'd worked with on freelance projects, people who'd seen her capabilities separate from Simon's shadow, who knew exactly who did the real work. No fancy titles designed to inflate egos, no hierarchy games meant to establish dominance, just competent professionals who respected results over egos, who understood that excellence spoke louder than job descriptions. The work consumed her in the best possible way, 18-hour days that felt different from the grinding exhaustion of saving Simon's sinking ship, different from the desperate treading water that had characterized her marriage. This exhaustion came with ownership, with the satisfaction of building something that couldn't be taken credit for by someone else's smile and handshake, with the certainty that every success belonged entirely to the people who actually achieved it. Word spread quietly through the industry like smoke under doors. The talented strategist was available again, operating independently, no longer attached to the mediocre salesman who'd been riding her coattails. Companies that had contracted with Harmer Consulting specifically for projects Fila had led began reaching out, asking diplomatic questions about her availability, carefully avoiding direct criticism of Simon while making their preferences abundantly clear. Simon sent emails to several of them, desperate messages about partnership obligations and contractual relationships and shared intellectual property. It backfired spectacularly. Professional circles are smaller than people think, and his transparent attempts to claim ownership of her reputation made him look exactly like what he was: a salesman losing his product, a fraud being exposed, a mediocrity who'd been coasting on someone else's genius. One evening, hunched over her desk reviewing proposals while the city darkened outside her windows, Fila's assistant knocked tentatively. "There's a gentleman here to see you, Tobias Winters. He doesn't have an appointment, but he says he was impressed by your presentation at the Boston conference and wanted to introduce himself properly." Fila remembered him vaguely. Silver threading through dark hair, intelligent questions during the Q&A, eyes that seemed to actually process her answers instead of waiting for his turn to talk. She'd been too exhausted after that conference to network properly, had declined the after-party to collapse in her hotel room with room service and silence and the relief of being alone with her thoughts. "Send him in." Tobias Winters carried himself with the ease of someone comfortable in his own skin. No aggressive posturing, no need to dominate space. He simply extended his hand and said, "I apologize for dropping by unannounced. I tried calling, but your assistant mentioned you're screening calls carefully these days." Smart man, acknowledging the barrier instead of pretending offense at it, respecting boundaries instead of trying to charm his way past them. "What can I do for you, Mr. Winters?" "Tobias, please. And actually, I'm here to ask what I can do for you." He settled into the chair across from her desk with relaxed confidence. "My firm specializes in supporting emerging companies with solid foundations and visionary leadership. Your presentation in Boston outlined approaches to ethical implementation that most people talk about, but very few actually understand how to execute. I'd like to explore whether there's an opportunity for strategic partnership." Fila studied him carefully, cataloguing every detail of his body language and word choice. She'd heard enough pitches from men who wanted to help her succeed while positioning themselves to control outcomes, who used words like partnership while meaning acquisition. "I'm not interested in being absorbed into someone else's portfolio. If that's what you're suggesting, we can end this conversation politely now. I'm suggesting investment capital in exchange for minority stake and advisory role, with all operational control remaining entirely with you." His directness matched hers, no dancing around terms or burying intentions in vague language. "I've built 3 successful ventures and sold 2 of them. I'm at a stage where I'm more interested in supporting genuine innovation than collecting companies like trophies." They talked for 90 minutes. He asked thoughtful questions about her growth strategy, her risk assessment, her vision for scaling without compromising the quality that made Nextcore choose her. Never once did he suggest she needed him to succeed. He framed it as her needing resources, and him having resources to offer in exchange for being part of something worthwhile, something that aligned with his values. When he left, Fila sat in the quiet office feeling something she hadn't felt in years, intellectually matched. Simon had always needed her to simplify concepts, to make her ideas accessible to his limited understanding, to translate brilliance into terms he could grasp and then repeat. Tobias had kept pace with her thinking and occasionally pushed her further, challenged assumptions she'd held without examining them. It felt dangerous and exhilarating at once, like standing at the edge of something that could either be freedom or another kind of cage. That night, Simon appeared at her apartment building. The doorman called up, apologetic and uncomfortable. "There's a Mr. Harmer insisting he lives here. Should I send him away?" "Yes, and please add him to the list of people who should never be granted access under any circumstances." Through her window, she watched Simon argue with the doorman before finally retreating to his car, his posture defeated and angry simultaneously. He sat there for over an hour, staring up at her building like his gaze alone could summon her, before finally driving away. Her phone, the new one, buzzed. "Tobias. Thought about our conversation. Would you be interested in continuing the discussion over dinner? Strictly professional, and you pick the restaurant so you're comfortable." Fila stared at the message. Her instinct screamed warnings about trusting anyone, about protecting the space she'd fought to claim, about maintaining the walls she'd built so carefully. But another part of her, the part that had once believed in partnership before Simon had corrupted the concept, wondered if there were actually people who collaborated without consuming, who elevated without diminishing. She typed, "Thursday evening, Anthony's downtown, professional attire, and bring your detailed analysis of my growth projections. If this is serious, prove it." His response came quickly. "See you Thursday. And I'm always serious about supporting actual talent." Below her window, Simon's car was gone. But even if it hadn't been, even if he'd stayed there all night watching her windows, it wouldn't have changed anything. The automatic doors had opened she'd walked through, and she was never, ever walking back. Chapter 4. His descent, her ascent. Simon's descent wasn't dramatic. No spectacular crash, no public scandal that would make satisfying headlines or provide the kind of vindication that feels good in the moment. Just the slow erosion of credibility that happens when the talented partner leaves and the remaining partner can't deliver what was promised, when the curtain pulls back to reveal the wizard was always just a man with a microphone. Harmer Consulting lost its first major client when the deliverables failed to match the proposals, when Simon's team produced competent but uninspired work that lacked the innovative edge clients had come to expect. The second client followed within weeks, citing concerns about consistency and vision, using diplomatic language that translated to, "We hired you for her brain, not your smile." By the third cancellation, industry whispers had become open knowledge, the kind of gossip that spreads through professional networks like wildfire. Simon Harmer had been coasting on someone else's genius, and now that genius worked elsewhere. He tried hiring, brought in consultants who had impressive credentials but couldn't replicate what Filler had brought to every project. The intuitive understanding of what clients actually needed versus what they claimed to want. The ability to see 3 moves ahead and position solutions before problems fully materialized. The new hires were competent. Filler had been extraordinary. There's no replacement for extraordinary, no amount of money that can purchase vision that comes from genuine brilliance rather than learned formulas. Meanwhile, Cumulo Solutions landed 3 substantial contracts in rapid succession. Companies that had watched Filler operate in the background during her marriage suddenly wanted her leadership front and center, wanted to work with the actual architect instead of the salesman who'd been taking credit. Her reputation wasn't just rehabilitated, it was revealed. People realized they'd been crediting the wrong person all along, that the magic had always come from her, while Simon merely performed the illusion of competence. The fourth contract came with a challenge. They needed someone who could navigate complex implementation across multiple departments with different priorities and competing agendas. Filler delivered a proposal so comprehensive, so elegantly solving problems they hadn't even articulated yet, that the CEO called her directly to express his admiration, to ask if she'd be interested in consulting on other projects beyond their initial scope. That CEO happened to be Tobias's former business partner, a connection that felt either like remarkable coincidence or like the universe conspiring towards something. Their professional dinners had become regular occurrences, scheduled weekly now. Tobias reviewed her projections with the thorough attention of someone genuinely invested in her success, not someone positioning to take control. He challenged assumptions, offered perspectives shaped by his own failures and victories, and never once tried to redirect her vision to match his comfort zone or his understanding of how things should work. After their 5th dinner, as they left the restaurant into evening air that smelled like rain approaching, he said casually, "I'm divorced. Has been final for 3 years. Thought you should know that my interest in your company is genuinely about your company, but my interest in these dinners is becoming about more than business strategy." Filler stopped walking. "I'm not ready for that conversation." "I know, which is why I'm mentioning it now, so you're not wondering about my motivations, so you don't have to waste energy trying to decode whether I'm being professional or personal. Take whatever time you need. I'm patient." His honesty felt like cold water after years of Simon's manipulations, years of decoding hidden meanings, and trying to translate what was actually happening beneath the surface of his words. She appreciated it and feared it in equal measure. Simon discovered their dinners through the same industry whispers that had broadcast his declining reputation. He showed up at her office building during lunch, disheveled in a way that suggested he'd been awake for days, his shirt wrinkled and his eyes bloodshot with exhaustion or tears, or both. Security called up. Filler came down herself, met him in the lobby where cameras and witnesses ensured safety. where the public nature of the space would prevent the kind of scene he might attempt in private. "You're seeing someone," he said without preamble, voice flat with accusation. "Tobias Winters. I looked him up. Successful, wealthy, sophisticated. Is that what this was about? Trading up?" "This is about me building a career separate from your shadow," Fila replied calmly, refusing to be pulled into his narrative. "Who I have dinner with is none of your concern." 7 years, Fila, 7 years of marriage, and you replace me in months? "I haven't replaced you, Simon. I've replaced the version of myself that thought enabling your mediocrity was love." He moved closer, and security tensed, hands moving toward intercept positions, but his approach wasn't threatening. It was broken, the movement of someone who'd lost all dignity and didn't care about appearances anymore. "I lost everything. The clients, the reputation, the credibility. Isabella left me too, said I was obsessed with you, that she couldn't compete with a ghost. I have nothing left." "You have exactly what you built by yourself," Fila said quietly, almost gently. "Without me propping you up, without me doing the actual work while you took credit, this is what you actually are. Maybe use this time to figure out who that person is, instead of trying to reclaim the woman who was doing your work for you. I need you. You need someone to make you look competent. I needed a partner who valued my contributions. We were never actually meeting each other's needs, Simon. I was just better at pretending we were, better at convincing myself that love meant sacrificing everything." She turned to leave. He grabbed her wrist, not violently but desperately, fingers wrapping around her arm with the grip of someone drowning. Security moved immediately, but Fila raised her free hand to stop them. "Let go," she said, looking directly at his hand on her arm, her voice carrying absolute authority. He released her immediately, then crumpled against the lobby wall like a puppet with cut strings. "I'll spend the rest of my life proving I've changed. I'll become the man worthy of you. Just tell me there's a chance, any chance at all." Fila looked at him with something that might have been pity if it weren't so exhausted, if it weren't filtered through years of disappointment and betrayal. "The man worthy of me would never have needed me to sacrifice everything to make him look successful. He would have celebrated my achievements instead of presenting them as his own. He would have been faithful when I was selling my grandmother's jewelry to save his company. You can't become that man retroactively, Simon. The chance died the moment those automatic doors opened, and I saw who you actually were." She walked to the elevator, pressed the button, and didn't look back as the doors closed, as the small space carried her away from him. In her office, she stood at the window watching the street below. Simon emerged from the building, stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, looking up at the tower like he could see her through steel and glass and all the walls she'd built, then walked away with the posture of someone who'd finally understood that some doors, once closed, have no keys. Her phone buzzed. "Tobias. Still on for tomorrow's strategy session. I have thoughts about your expansion timeline that you're either going to love or argue with passionately." Fila smiled despite herself, despite the confrontation still making her hands shake slightly. Arguing with someone who understood her language, who challenged her without undermining her, who made her think harder instead of smaller, that was what collaboration actually looked like. She typed back, "Bring your arguments, I'll bring mine. May the best logic win." Outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the city. Somewhere in those shadows, Simon was driving back to an empty house filled with furniture Fila had chosen and debts she'd tried to prevent. She felt no satisfaction in his suffering. She felt the quiet power of knowing his suffering wasn't her responsibility anymore. Chapter 5. The Dinner of Consequences. The restaurant Simon chose was deliberate in its significance, the same place he'd proposed 7 years ago, the corner table where he'd promised her forever while sliding a ring across white tablecloth, where she'd said yes, believing his promises were foundation instead of performance. Fila agreed to meet him there, not from sentimentality, but from strategy. Let him see what he'd lost, in the exact place he'd convinced her to trust him. Let him sit with the ghost of who they'd been and recognize everything he'd destroyed. She arrived deliberately late, letting him sit with anticipation and anxiety, letting him rehearse whatever speech he'd prepared. When she entered wearing a burgundy dress she'd purchased for herself the previous week, confidence radiating from her posture and stride, she watched something break behind his eyes. This wasn't the exhausted woman who'd sold her car to make his payroll. This was someone who'd remembered what she looked like when she wasn't carrying someone else's failures, when she wasn't diminishing herself to make him feel adequate. Simon stood awkwardly, uncertain whether to attempt a kiss on her cheek, his body language screaming confusion about protocols for meeting the wife he'd betrayed. Fila settled that question by sliding directly into her chair, maintaining professional distance, treating this like a business meeting because that's all it was. "Thank you for agreeing to this," he began, hands clasped on the table like a penitent in confession, like someone performing humility. "I have an hour," she replied, checking her watch with deliberate significance, establishing boundaries immediately. "Make it count." He'd prepared a speech. She could see it in the way his eyes moved, referencing mental notes he'd rehearsed in mirrors, probably workshopped with his therapist, to maximize emotional impact. "I've been in therapy, intensive sessions, 3 times weekly. Dr. Brennan specializes in narcissistic patterns and accountability work. I'm confronting behaviors I didn't even recognize as harmful, seeing how I manipulated and controlled and took credit without acknowledging the harm." Fila sipped her water, expression neutral, giving him nothing. "The affair with Isabella, it wasn't about her. It was about me running from inadequacy. Every time you succeeded, every time your brilliance became undeniable, I felt smaller. Instead of celebrating you, I tried to diminish your achievements so I wouldn't have to face my own mediocrity. Isabella was just validation that I could still attract someone, that I still had value separate from your shadow. So you cheated because my competence threatened your ego," Fila summarized flatly, reducing his therapeutic language to its essential truth. "That's your explanation." "It's not an excuse. It's the truth I'm finally confronting." He leaned forward, earnest desperation in every line of his face, in the tension around his mouth. "I'm selling the house, downsizing to an apartment I can actually afford. I've taken a job, not consulting, just steady project management work that's within my actual capabilities. I'm building a life based on what I can genuinely offer, not inflated promises I need someone else to fulfill." The waiter appeared. Fila ordered grilled salmon and salad. Simon asked for the same, though she doubted he'd taste anything, doubted he had any appetite beyond the desperation to convince her of his transformation. "I'm impressed," she said, when the waiter retreated, her tone carefully neutral. "Genuinely. Personal growth is difficult work, and it sounds like you're engaging with it sincerely." Hope flickered across his features like a match in darkness. "But none of that changes what happened," she continued, extinguishing that hope with factual precision. "None of your therapy sessions rewind time to give me back my grandmother's necklace. Your accountability doesn't restore the 2 years I spent grinding myself into exhaustion while you were texting Isabella during my late-night work sessions. Your recognition of narcissistic patterns doesn't erase 7 years of you accepting credit for my ideas without ever publicly acknowledging where the brilliance actually originated. I know I can't fix the past. You can't even properly apologize for it, Simon. You just explained why you did what you did, like understanding your motivations somehow mitigates the harm. Like if I understand the psychology behind your betrayal, I should forgive it. That's still narcissism. You're making your growth journey about how it affects you, not about the wreckage you left in my life. His jaw tightened. She watched him cycle through responses, defensiveness rising, then being suppressed by whatever his therapist had taught him about accountability, about not making excuses. "You're right," he finally said, and the admission seemed to cost him something. "I'm sorry. Not sorry I got caught. Not sorry it ended badly for me. Sorry that I hurt you. Sorry that I took your sacrifices for granted. Sorry that I betrayed you when you deserved absolute loyalty. Sorry that I stole credit for your work and convinced myself I'd earned the recognition. Just sorry. For all of it." Phyla studied him across the table, noting the weight loss, the dark circles, the tremor in his hands. The apology was probably as genuine as he was capable of delivering. It still changed nothing, meant nothing, repaired nothing. "I accept your apology," she said quietly, each word deliberate. "And I acknowledge the work you're doing to become better. But accepting your apology doesn't mean reconciliation. It just means I'm choosing not to carry anger about who you were. It means I'm releasing you from my emotional energy. But if I'm becoming someone different, then be that person for someone else. I don't want the improved version of you, Simon. I want my life without you in it. I want to stop having this conversation in my head. Stop defending boundaries you keep testing. Stop explaining why your growth doesn't earn you another chance." Desperation cracked through his practiced composure like ice breaking. "The business is collapsing. I've lost almost everything. Doesn't that prove I've learned how much I need you?" "It proves you were dependent on me. That's not the same as needing me. You need someone to rescue you from consequences. I need a partner who would never put me in the position of being their only rescue, who would never require me to save them from their own choices." Their food arrived. Phyla ate steadily, tasting every bite, savoring the salmon and the vegetables and the simple pleasure of a meal she could afford herself. Simon pushed food around his plate, appetite destroyed by the conversation, by watching her eat calmly while his world collapsed. He tried another angle, voice dropping to intimate pleading, to the tone he'd used in their bedroom when he wanted something. "Don't you miss what we had? The good parts, before everything fell apart. We had real moments, Phyla, real love. We had me loving you while you loved the image of yourself my devotion created," she corrected, meeting his eyes directly. "Those aren't the same thing. You loved having someone brilliant make you look brilliant. I loved someone who never actually existed." "That's not fair. You had Isabella in your arms while I was signing the contract that would save your company. Please don't lecture me about fairness." Simon's control finally fractured. His voice rose enough to draw glances from nearby tables, heads turning toward the commotion. "I made one mistake, one affair. People rebuild from worse." "People rebuild when both parties want to rebuild," Phyla said calmly, refusing to match his volume, refusing to give him the satisfaction of making her lose composure. "I don't want to rebuild with you. I want to build something entirely new, with someone who doesn't require me to sacrifice my identity to prop up his ego. Someone like Tobias Winters." Bitterness poisoned his tone, turning his features ugly. "Is that what this is about? You already found my replacement." "This is about me finding myself again after 7 years of losing myself in your needs, in your expectations, in your constant requirement for validation." She placed her napkin on the table, meal barely touched, but appetite satisfied by the conversation's conclusion. As she stood to leave, Simon grabbed her wrist across the table, the same desperate gesture he'd used in her office lobby. The same grasping that characterized everything about how he related to her. "I will spend the rest of my life proving I've changed." Phyla looked at his hand on her arm, then met his eyes with absolute finality, with the cold certainty of someone who'd made a decision and wouldn't be swayed. "Spend it however you want. Just spend it away from me." She pulled her wrist free gently and walked toward the exit. Behind her, Simon called out once more, "I love you. That has to count for something." She paused at the restaurant door, looking back at him one final time. "It counts for 7 years of me believing love meant sacrificing everything. Now I know better." Outside, twilight painted the sky in shades of amber and violet. Tobias waited beside his car, leaning against it with relaxed patience, scrolling through his phone, but looking up immediately when she emerged. He'd offered to drive her home after the dinner, understanding without being told that she might need someone steady nearby afterward. "How'd it go?" he asked as she approached. He apologized. He's in therapy. He's downsizing his life. He's genuinely trying to improve. But none of that earns him another chance at destroying me. None of it rewinds time. None of it makes me want him back. Tobias opened the passenger door. "Good. Would have been worried about your judgment if you'd said otherwise." As they drove through the city streets, Fila watched Simon through the restaurant window. He sat alone at the table, shoulders collapsed inward, staring at her abandoned meal like it contained answers instead of salmon going cold. She felt no triumph, no satisfaction, just the quiet relief of having said everything that needed saying and meaning every word. Tobias glanced at her. "You hungry? Looked like you barely touched dinner." "Starving, actually. Thai place near your apartment makes incredible curry. We could grab takeout, and you could tell me about it if you want, or we could grab takeout, and you could tell me about literally anything else. Your choice." Fila smiled. The first genuine smile she'd managed all evening. "Curry sounds perfect. And maybe we talk about your expansion thoughts for my company. Something productive instead of dwelling on what's already dead." "Deal." Through the rearview mirror, the restaurant faded into distance. Fila didn't look back, didn't waste energy wondering if Simon was still sitting there or if he'd left. The dinner of consequences had served its purpose. Simon knew where he stood now, firmly in her past, with no path forward, with no amount of therapy or transformation that would change her decision, and that knowledge felt like the final door, closing on a chapter she was ready to stop rereading. Chapter 6. Parallel Universes. Simon's campaign of redemption became increasingly desperate and increasingly public, a performance designed for an audience that wasn't watching. He started a personal blog titled Rebuilding After Betrayal, where he documented his therapy sessions in vague emotional terms, never naming Fila, but writing with enough identifying details that anyone in their professional circles knew exactly who the brilliant partner I betrayed referred to. Each post accumulated comments praising his vulnerability and courage, which he screenshot and somehow made sure circulated through mutual connections, evidence he was trying to frame as proof of his transformation. Flowers arrived at Fila's office every Monday morning without fail, a ritual of attempted atonement. Different arrangements each week, always expensive, always accompanied by handwritten cards quoting poetry about second chances and redemption and the patience required to earn back trust. Her assistant asked once if she should stop accepting them, if turning them away at delivery might send a clearer message. Fila instructed her to donate every bouquet to the hospital 3 blocks away, where patients might actually appreciate them, where beauty might serve someone who wasn't using it as manipulation. Every Friday, a letter appeared in her mailbox, handwritten on expensive stationery that probably cost more than he could afford. Each one outlined specific changes Simon was making. Boundaries he'd established with female colleagues, financial transparency practices he'd implemented, ways he was learning to celebrate others' successes without feeling threatened. The letters were well written, emotionally intelligent, probably workshopped with his therapist to maximize impact while maintaining plausible deniability about harassment. Fila read the first 3, then started recycling them unopened. His growth journey wasn't her concern anymore. His transformation wasn't her responsibility to witness or validate. While Simon performed his redemption for an invisible audience, Fila actually transformed, actually built something, actually became the person she'd always had potential to be. Cumulo Solutions expanded into a second office in Chicago, a clean, modern space that reflected her aesthetic and values. She hired carefully, prioritizing talent that had been overlooked by traditional systems, women returning to work after raising families, immigrants whose credentials weren't respected despite their brilliance, younger professionals who had vision but lacked connections. She built a culture of actual collaboration, where ideas mattered more than who voiced them, where credit went to those who earned it, where success was measured by results rather than performance of importance. The next core contract led to referrals. Those referrals led to reputation. That reputation led to opportunities that would never have been possible under Simon's leadership, because he'd always played it safe, always chosen the path that made him look good over the path that achieved actual excellence. Fila understood how to take calculated risks that paid off exponentially, how to see possibilities others missed. She traveled to conferences now, presenting under her own name, about implementation strategies and ethical frameworks, speaking to packed rooms about topics she'd mastered through years of actual practice. People listened intently, leaned forward in their seats, asked sophisticated questions that demonstrated they understood the depth of what she was sharing. They sought her out afterward for deeper conversations, for consulting opportunities, for partnerships built on mutual respect. It felt surreal and entirely natural at once. This was who she'd always been, just finally visible without Simon's mediocrity blocking the light. Tobias became a constant presence, though never intrusive, never demanding. He understood the difference between being available and being demanding, between showing up and taking over. They had dinner regularly, sometimes discussing business expansion strategies, sometimes debating philosophy or literature, or whether the restaurant's dessert menu was ambitiously creative or pretentiously ridiculous. The conversations flowed with easy intelligence, with the comfort of two minds that operated at similar speeds. During one such dinner, Tobias mentioned his divorce with the same casual honesty he approached everything. No performance or seeking sympathy. She told me I was married to my work more than to her. She was right. I was building an empire, but forgetting to build a life. Took me 2 years of therapy to understand that success without partnership feels hollow, but partnership shouldn't require someone to make themselves smaller. That's remarkably self-aware, Fila observed, appreciating his ability to own his failures without drowning in them. That's remarkably expensive therapy, he corrected with a slight smile. But worth it. I'd rather be alone and honest than coupled and performing someone I'm not. Their conversations flowed with the ease of intellectual equals, of people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. He challenged her thinking without dismissing it, appreciated her expertise without fetishizing it, made her laugh without trying too hard, and crucially, never once pressured her about where their relationship was heading, content to let it develop at whatever pace felt natural. After one late dinner, walking to their cars through the parking garage that echoed with their footsteps, Tobias said casually, "I'm falling in love with you. Have been for months. But I need you to know. I don't need you to say it back. I just needed to be honest." Fila stopped walking, her breath catching in her throat. That's not a casual thing to say. I know, which is why I waited until I was certain, until I'd examined it from every angle to make sure this was real and not just attraction or admiration. He met her eyes steadily, no flinching from vulnerability. You're rebuilding your entire life. I'm not trying to insert myself into that process or rush anything. Just wanted you to know where I stand, so you're never wondering or guessing. His transparency felt revolutionary after 7 years of Simon's manipulations and hidden agendas, 7 years of trying to decode what was actually happening beneath surface conversations. She kissed him, not desperately, not as a declaration of forever, but as an acknowledgement of something real growing between them, something built on honesty instead of need, on admiration instead of dependency. When they pulled apart, Tobias said quietly, "We can go as slow as you need. I appreciate that, because I'm still figuring out who I am, separate from who I was in that marriage." "Then keep figuring it out. I'll be here when you're ready for more." The following week, Fila returned from a successful client presentation to find a package on her desk. Inside was a check for $47,000 and a note in Simon's handwriting. "Partial repayment for everything you invested in me. I know money can't fix what I broke, but it's all I have left to offer." Her assistant stood in the doorway, uncertainty written across her face. "What do you want me to do with it?" Fila stared at the check. It represented the cash value of her grandmother's necklace, her car, various liquidated assets she'd poured into his failing company. It wasn't close to repayment for the emotional toll, for the years of her life spent propping up his mediocrity, but it was probably everything he actually had after selling the house and downsizing. "Set up a scholarship fund," she said finally, decision crystallizing as she spoke. "For young women in technical fields who show exceptional promise but lack financial resources, deposit this as the founding contribution." Should we tell him? No. What I do with his guilt isn't his business anymore. The scholarship fund launched quietly. Fila named it after her grandmother, the woman whose ruby necklace had bought her final months of believing in Simon's promises. It felt right, transforming that loss into something that would help other women avoid sacrificing themselves for men's mediocrity. Simon's weekly letters continued arriving like clockwork. Fila's recycling bin filled with unopened envelopes, each one testament to his refusal to accept her silence as answer. His blog posts grew more maudlin, more clearly fishing for her attention through performative vulnerability, through crafting himself as the tragic figure, learning too late what he'd lost. His flowers kept being donated, kept brightening hospital rooms instead of manipulating her. And through it all, Fila kept building, kept expanding, kept becoming more fully herself than she'd ever been when half her energy went toward propping up someone else's ego. One evening, reviewing quarterly projections with her core team, Fila realized she'd stopped thinking about Simon entirely. Unless forced to, by his intrusions, he'd become irrelevant. Not through active effort to forget him, but through the simple fact that her present was too compelling to waste mental space on her past. That night, she met Tobias for dinner. He had an idea about expanding into consulting for non-profits, bringing her ethical implementation frameworks to organizations that couldn't typically afford high-level strategic support. They talked for 3 hours, ideas building on ideas, excitement generating momentum, both contributing equally to a vision that belonged to neither individually but to them collectively. Walking to her car afterward, Tobias took her hand, a simple gesture that felt monumental in its ease, in its lack of demand or pressure. "This is what partnership looks like," Fila said aloud, the realization landing with quiet power. "What do you mean?" "You just spent 3 hours helping me develop an idea that doesn't benefit you at all. You were genuinely excited about my vision without needing to insert yourself into it or take credit for it." "Well, yeah," Tobias said simply, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "Your success doesn't diminish mine. That's kind of the whole point of partnership, multiplying instead of dividing." Simon had never understood that, probably still didn't, even with all his therapy. But Fila finally did, and that understanding was worth more than any apology he could craft. Chapter 7. The Harassment escalates. The conference in Houston should have been routine, just another speaking engagement in the calendar that had filled up rapidly as her reputation solidified. Fila was presenting a keynote about inclusive implementation strategies, the kind of presentation she could deliver in her sleep now, though she never did. She prepared meticulously for each audience, tailored examples, coordinated with event organizers about timing and logistics and what specific challenges their industry faced. What she hadn't coordinated was Simon's attendance. He appeared during the networking reception the evening before her presentation, moving through the crowd with the determination of someone on a mission, his eyes scanning faces until they locked on hers. Fila saw him before he reached her, that familiar face now gaunt from stress and sleepless nights, wearing a suit that hung slightly too loose on his diminished frame, looking like a man who'd stopped eating properly. She excused herself from the conversation with a potential client from Denver and intercepted him near the refreshment table, away from witnesses but visible to the crowd. "What are you doing here?" "It's a public conference. I bought a ticket." "This is my professional space, Simon. You're crossing boundaries we've established repeatedly." "I'm attending an industry event," he countered, voice artificially calm, practiced. "Just like hundreds of other people. If you happen to be here too, that's coincidence." But it wasn't coincidence, and they both knew it. He'd tracked her speaking schedule somehow, probably through her company's public events calendar, possibly through contacts who didn't understand why she wanted distance from him. He'd positioned himself deliberately in her path, orchestrated this encounter with the same manipulation he'd used throughout their marriage, throughout the reception. She felt his eyes following her like physical weight. Every conversation she had, every networking connection she made, conducted under his watchful observation, his presence contaminating space she'd carefully built separate from him. It felt violating in a way his letters and flowers hadn't. This invasion of physical space, this refusal to respect the boundaries she'd tried to establish. Her presentation the next morning went flawlessly, despite her awareness that he sat in the fourth row, taking notes like an attentive student studying material he'd somehow missed the first time, like he was cataloguing her brilliance now that it was no longer available for him to exploit. When she finished to enthusiastic applause, Simon was first on his feet for the standing ovation, his clapping deliberate and prolonged, a performance of support that made her skin crawl. During the Q&A session, his hand shot up immediately. The moderator called on him before Fila could indicate she wouldn't accept his question, before she could signal that his participation wasn't welcome. "You mentioned the importance of acknowledging all contributors to successful projects," Simon said, voice carrying through the conference hall with calculated projection. "How do you recommend handling situations where previous collaborative partnerships dissolved, but the methodologies developed during that partnership continue informing current work?" The question was calculated, designed to force her acknowledgement of their shared history in front of hundreds of witnesses, to create a narrative where he'd contributed to her current success. Fila saw the trap clearly, saw exactly what he was trying to accomplish. "I recommend transparency about influence while maintaining clarity about authorship," she replied evenly, meeting his eyes directly. "Methodologies evolve through many influences, but the person implementing and refining them owns that evolution. Previous contexts inform present work without dictating it. Credit belongs to those who do the actual work, not those who were merely present." She moved to the next question without acknowledging Simon further, without giving him the engagement he was seeking. After the conference, hotel security informed her that Simon had attempted to book a room on her floor, claiming they were traveling together, that they had reconciled. They denied the request based on her previous instructions to flag his name, to prevent exactly this kind of manipulation. Tobias, who'd flown out to Houston as much for moral support as for business meetings he'd scheduled with contacts in the area, listened to the security report with increasing concern, his jaw tightening. "This isn't healthy persistence anymore," he said carefully, trying not to overstep, but unable to hide his worry. This is obsession. I know, Fila admitted, exhaustion settling into her bones like sediment. He's escalating because the letters and flowers aren't getting response. He's trying different tactics, testing different boundaries to see what might work. What do you want to do about it? She appreciated that he asked instead of dictated, that he treated this as her decision to make, her boundaries to enforce. I want to make it legally clear that further contact is harassment, that there are consequences beyond my personal refusal. Her attorney drafted a comprehensive cease and desist letter, backed by documentation of the flowers, the letters, the blog posts that violated her privacy by sharing identifying details of their relationship, the conference attendance that constituted stalking behavior. The legal language was precise, professional, and unambiguous. Any further direct or indirect contact would result in restraining order proceedings. Simon's response came through his own attorney, a letter that managed to be both defensive and pleading, that tried to reframe harassment as persistent love. Mr. Harmer requests one final opportunity for couples therapy. He believes marriage counseling could provide structured space for reconciliation attempts. Fila's response was equally formal and significantly shorter. Ms. Kumalo declines all reconciliation attempts. The marriage is irretrievably dissolved. Further contact will be met with legal action. For 2 weeks, silence. Blessed, beautiful silence. Fila began to hope the legal intervention had actually worked, that Simon had finally understood the seriousness of her boundaries. Then, her company's social media coordinator showed her Simon's latest blog post, her expression apologetic and angry simultaneously. It was titled, "When Success Requires Amnesia," and detailed his version of their relationship, how he'd supported her career development, encouraged her professional growth, stepped back to let her shine, only to be discarded when she no longer needed him, carefully worded to avoid direct lies, but constructed to paint himself as the selfless partner, destroyed by her ruthless ambition, the loyal husband abandoned when he was no longer useful. The comments section filled with supporters calling Fila ungrateful, mercenary, cruel for abandoning someone who'd loved her through her struggles. Some people clearly knew who she was from context. Others were just generic internet moral philosophers rushing to judgment based on carefully curated information. Her attorney added it to the harassment documentation, the file growing thicker. Tobias found her in her office that evening, staring at the blog post on her screen, reading the comments that painted her as villain in a story Simon had constructed from half-truths and omissions. He didn't ask what was wrong. He could see the evidence glowing from the monitor. "He's rewriting history," Fila said quietly, voice hollow, "making himself the victim of my success instead of the beneficiary of my sacrifice. People who matter know the truth. Do they? Or do they just know competing narratives and choose whichever feels more compelling, whichever confirms their existing beliefs about how relationships work?" Tobias pulled a chair beside her, rather than staying on the opposite side of the desk, closing the physical distance to offer solidarity. "The people who've worked with you know your integrity. The clients who've experienced your brilliance know your competence. The colleagues who've watched you build something from nothing know your strength. Simon can perform victimhood for internet strangers, but he can't erase your actual reputation with people who matter." She leaned against him, drawing comfort from his solidity, from the certainty in his voice. "I just want him to disappear, to move on with his life and let me move on with mine. That would require him to accept that he lost something irreplaceable and it's actually gone. Some people never accept that. Some people spend years trying to force reality to match their fantasy." The next conference Fila attended, security had Simon's photo with explicit instructions, his face added to watch lists. When he attempted to register, they quietly denied him entry and informed Phila immediately, allowing her to present without the contamination of his presence. His blog post about being excluded from professional spaces due to personal relationship complications portrayed him as persecuted, as censored, as punished for loving too much. Her attorney filed preliminary restraining order paperwork, documenting the pattern of escalation, the refusal to respect boundaries. And through it all, Phila kept building, kept expanding, kept refusing to let his escalating harassment diminish what she'd created, kept showing up to work and conferences and her own life with the determination of someone who wouldn't be forced into hiding one evening, leaving her office late after finalizing a major contract that would expand her team by 20 people. She found Tobias waiting in the lobby, jacket draped over his arm. "I have a dinner meeting across town," he said casually, checking his phone like his presence was coincidental. "Thought you might want company on your walk to the parking garage." She understood what he wasn't saying, that he'd tracked her late work nights and positioned himself as subtle protection, without making her feel fragile or controlled, without making his concern into restriction. "I'd like that," she said, gratitude warming her chest. Walking through the parking structure with his presence beside her, Phila realized that security didn't have to mean restriction. Partnership didn't have to mean losing autonomy. And love, real love, looked like someone showing up consistently without demanding recognition for basic decency. Simon had never understood any of that Tobias did, and that difference was everything. Chapter 8. Love Without Conditions. The coastal vineyards stretched across rolling hills like something from a painting, grapevines heavy with late summer fruit, catching golden afternoon light that turned everything amber and magical Phila and Tobias had driven up for the weekend, ostensibly to meet with the vineyard owner about potential consulting work on their expansion strategy, but really just to breathe air that didn't smell like city exhaust and obligations, to exist somewhere that felt removed from the constant pressure of building and protecting and defending. They walked between the rows, soil warm beneath their feet, conversation meandering through topics with the ease of people completely comfortable in each other's presence, no need to fill silence or perform interest. They discussed everything and nothing. Philosophy, recent books they'd read, whether the vineyard's terroir actually affected taste or if wine culture was elaborate placebo effect. Tobias stopped at a vista point overlooking the valley, the view stretching for miles. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to just listen until I'm finished. Can you do that?" Phila nodded, heart suddenly accelerating despite the peaceful surroundings, despite the warmth of sun on her shoulders. "I love you," he began, and she noticed he wasn't nervous, just intentional, choosing each word with care, treating this declaration like the serious commitment it was. "I love your intelligence, the way you dismantle complex problems and rebuild them into elegant solutions. I love your integrity, how you refuse to compromise your principles even when it would be easier, even when it would be profitable. I love your strength, the way you rebuilt yourself after someone tried to convince you their failures were your responsibility. I love how you laugh at terrible puns and how you get competitive about meaningless games and how you remember tiny details people mention in passing." He paused, making sure she was actually hearing him, not just waiting for her turn to speak. "I want to build a life with you. Not because I need you to complete me. I'm already complete. Not because I want to fix you. You're not broken. Not because I have some fantasy about saving you. You saved yourself spectacularly. I want to share life with you because being with you makes everything richer, food tastes better, ideas develop further, silence feels comfortable, success means more when I get to tell you about it. Problems feel manageable when we tackle them together." The vineyard breeze carried the scent of grapes and earth and possibility warm against her skin. "I'm asking you to marry me," Tobias continued, pulling a small box from his pocket with the confidence of someone who'd thought this through completely. But I'm asking because I want to be your partner in all things, not because I need you to validate my existence. If you say no, I'll be disappointed, but I'll survive, because I was whole before I met you. If you say yes, I promise to spend every day remembering that you're whole too, that you don't need me, you choose me, and that's the whole point. Fila took the box, opened it to reveal a simple platinum band with a single stone. Elegant without being ostentatious, beautiful without demanding attention, expensive without being wasteful. Simon proposed with a speech about how I completed him, she said quietly, turning the box in her hands, how he couldn't imagine life without me, how I made him a better man. Every sentence was about what I did for him, how I served his needs, how my existence functioned to improve his. That's not partnership, that's parasitism. I know that now. She looked at the ring, then at Tobias, at his patient expression, waiting for her actual response. You're asking because you want to share success, not because you need someone to create it for you. Exactly. They walked further into the vineyard, Fila turning the ring box in her hands, Tobias giving her space to process without pressuring for immediate answer, without making his question into demand. I spent 7 years believing love meant sacrifice, she finally said, voicing thoughts she'd been processing for months. That partnership required making myself smaller so someone else could feel bigger. That devotion was measured by how much of myself I was willing to erase. And now? Now I know that real partnership is multiplication, not division. Two people bringing their full selves and creating something that honors both. She slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, like it had been made specifically for her hand. Yes, I'll marry you. Because you see me completely and love me anyway. Because you challenge me without crushing me. Because partnership with you feels like expansion, not contraction. Tobias kissed her then, gentle and certain. The kind of kiss that promises without demanding, that celebrates without possessing. The engagement announcement appeared in a profile piece about Tobias's investment firm partnering with Cumulo Solutions on an innovative initiative around ethical frameworks in emerging markets. The article mentioned the personal relationship almost as an afterthought. Both parties were private about personal matters, the journalist noted, preferring to let their professional accomplishments speak for themselves. Simon saw it online. Through a mutual friend who still maintained awkward connections to both parties, despite knowing the full history, he sent a message. I just want her to be happy. If she's happy, I can finally let go. The mutual friend, uncomfortable with being messenger and regretting maintaining the connection, forwarded it to Fila with apologies for the intrusion. Fila's response was brief and final. He let go the day he chose Isabella. I've been happy for a long time. He just wasn't paying attention. She asked the mutual friend to make clear this was the last communication she'd accept through intermediaries. Any further contact would be documented as harassment and added to legal proceedings. Then she deleted the message thread and returned her attention to wedding planning, to the joyful work of creating a celebration that honored both her and Tobias. Unlike her first wedding, which had been Simon's vision executed with her labor, traditional and expensive, and designed to impress his family and colleagues, this celebration would be intimate and meaningful. A ceremony that honored both families' traditions, held at the vineyard where Tobias proposed, focused on actual partnership rather than performing relationship success for audiences who didn't matter. During a venue tour with the event coordinator, a pleasant woman with efficient warmth, she mentioned casually, "We had another inquiry about your date from someone named Simon Harmer. We told him the date was booked, but he was quite persistent about confirming it was your wedding." Fila's smile didn't falter, though something cold settled in her stomach. Though the intrusion felt like violation, that man doesn't get to attend the life he tried to destroy. The coordinator nodded professionally, making notes. We've added his name and photo to our security protocols. He won't get past the entrance. Tobias, standing beside her reviewing catering options, squeezed her hand gently. You okay? I'm better than okay. I'm protected by people who actually respect my boundaries. They selected menu options that blended both their preferences, confirmed timing that worked for family traveling from different states, discussed music preferences that reflected them both. Every choice felt collaborative, neither person dominating decisions, both contributing preferences that got synthesized into something reflecting them both. That evening, reviewing the day's decisions over wine on Tobias's deck, overlooking the city lights beginning to flicker on, Phyla said quietly, I keep waiting for this to feel too good to be real, for the other shoe to drop. That's trauma response, Tobias replied gently, understanding in his voice. When you've been betrayed, happiness feels suspicious. Your brain learned that good things precede bad things, so it stays vigilant. How do I stop waiting for betrayal? By noticing I keep showing up without betraying you, by accumulating evidence that contradicts your fear, by giving time the chance to prove I'm consistent. She leaned against him, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of copper and amber. Thank you for being patient with my healing. You're not broken. You're healing. There's a difference. Somewhere across the city, Simon was probably composing another blog post about loss and redemption, probably crafting another letter outlining his transformation journey, probably finding new ways to insert himself into a narrative Phyla had moved beyond completely. But here, in this moment, with Tobias's arm around her shoulders and wedding plans taking shape and a future built on actual partnership spreading before her, Simon's obsession felt distant and irrelevant. The automatic doors had opened on truth. She'd walked through, and she was never, ever looking back. Chapter 9. His final performance. The week before the wedding, autumn arrived early with crisp mornings and leaves turning amber and gold. Phyla was finalizing seating arrangements in her office when her mother called, voice tight with restrained anger that vibrated through the phone line. That man is at my house. Phyla's blood went cold, pen freezing mid-notation. Simon is at your house? Showed up 20 minutes ago with flowers and some ridiculous letter. Your father is handling it, but I thought you should know immediately. She grabbed her keys, told her assistant to cancel her afternoon meetings without explanation, and drove across town with her heart hammering against her ribs like it was trying to escape her chest. This wasn't persistence anymore. This was escalation that crossed into genuine alarm, into territory that required intervention. By the time she arrived, Simon's car was still in her parents' driveway, blocking the mailbox. Her father stood on the front lawn, arms crossed, expression thunderous in a way she'd rarely seen. The protective rage of a parent watching their child be harassed. Simon sat on the porch steps, head in his hands, the picture of theatrical despair that might have moved her years ago, but now just looked pathetic. Phyla parked and approached slowly, assessing the situation with the same strategic mind she brought to business problems. Neighbors had noticed the commotion. Curtains twitched in windows. A few people stood in their yards pretending to garden, while clearly watching the drama unfold. Her father saw her first. I told him you weren't interested in his apologies. He won't leave. Simon looked up, and Phyla was shocked by how wrecked he appeared. Weight loss had carved hollows under his cheekbones that looked skeletal. Dark circles shadowed his eyes like bruises. His hands trembled slightly as he stood, the shake of someone who'd been living on stress and sleeplessness. Phyla, please, just 5 minutes. That's all I ask. You don't get to ask me for anything anymore, she replied calmly, positioning herself between him and her parents' front door. You definitely don't get to harass my parents in their own home. I'm not harassing. I'm trying to give you this. He held out an envelope, thick with pages, his hand shaking. It's everything I've been working on. My therapy breakthroughs, my financial recovery plan, my complete understanding of what I destroyed and how I've changed. Just read it, please. 5 minutes of your time. No. The simplicity of her refusal seemed to break something in him, seemed to shatter whatever fragile hope he'd been carrying. I've spent 2 years becoming worthy of you. 2 years of therapy, accountability work, facing my narcissism, rebuilding my entire approach to relationships. I've documented every step, changed everything about how I operate. Doesn't that earn me one conversation? You've spent 2 years trying to earn back something that wasn't yours to lose, Fila corrected quietly, each word deliberate and cutting. I was never yours, Simon. I was your partner, and you betrayed that partnership. What you've been doing isn't transformation, it's performance. You're not becoming better for yourself. You're becoming whatever you think will convince me to come back. That's not true. It is true. Real growth happens because you want to be better, not because you want to win back what you lost. You're still making everything about you, your pain, your redemption, your journey. You showed up at my parents' house, created a scene in their neighborhood, frightened my mother, and you think that demonstrates change, that demonstrates respect for boundaries. Simon's face crumpled, features collapsing like a sandcastle hit by waves. I love you. I've always loved you. I made one terrible mistake. You made 1,000 mistakes, Fila interrupted, voice rising slightly despite her intention to stay calm, despite wanting to maintain composure. You took credit for my work for 7 years. You spent my sacrifices like they were your entitlement. You cheated when I was selling my grandmother's jewelry to save your company. Isabella wasn't one mistake. She was the moment I could no longer ignore what you'd been all along. A user, a taker, someone who saw my brilliance as resource to exploit rather than partner to celebrate. Tears streamed down his face now, ugly crying that made him look even more pathetic, and part of Fila felt the old impulse to comfort him, to make his pain smaller. She crushed that impulse deliberately, recognizing it as the same pattern that had kept her trapped for years. I've changed, he sobbed, the words breaking apart. I'm not the man who hurt you. Good. Then go be that man somewhere else. Build a life based on who you've become instead of obsessing over who you lost. Find someone who gets to experience your growth without carrying the scars from your previous failures. But leave me alone. Stop showing up places I exist. Stop writing about our relationship online. Stop sending flowers and letters and performing transformation like it earns you access to my life. You're marrying him, Tobias. I've seen the announcements. Yes, I'm marrying someone who respects me, who celebrates my success instead of resenting it, who would never dream of taking credit for my work or betraying me when I'm vulnerable, someone who's actually my partner instead of my dependent. Simon stood abruptly, and Fila's father stepped closer, protective instinct activated, body language making clear he'd physically intervene if necessary. But Simon just swayed slightly, looking defeated rather than threatening, looking like a man who'd finally run out of strategies. I lost everything, he said, voice hollow and broken. My company failed. My reputation is ruined. My career is mediocre project management work that bores me. I have nothing. You have what you built by yourself, Fila said with finality, with the cold certainty of someone stating facts, without me doing the actual work while you took the credit. This is who you are when you're not standing on my shoulders, when you're not exploiting my talent to make yourself look competent. But I love you. You love the idea of not being the villain in your own narrative. That's different from loving me. You love avoiding consequences. You love rewriting history so you look like the victim instead of the betrayer. She turned to walk back to her car. Simon called after her, desperation shredding his voice into something almost feral. "I'll spend the rest of my life proving I've changed." Fila stopped, looked back one final time, memorizing his face so she could remember this moment when her resolve ever wavered. "I spent 7 years proving I loved you by sacrificing everything. I'm done proving anything to you, and you should be done proving anything to me. We're finished, Simon. Not because you haven't changed enough, but because I've changed completely. The woman who would take you back doesn't exist anymore. I killed her to survive you." She got in her car and drove away without looking in the rearview mirror, hands steady on the wheel despite adrenaline making her heart race. Her father called an hour later to report that Simon had finally left after sitting on their porch for another 40 minutes, staring at the street like he was waiting for her to change her mind and return. He'd left the envelope of documentation, which her father had immediately disposed of without reading, had thrown in the trash with yesterday's newspapers. Fila's attorney documented the incident, added it to the growing file of harassment evidence that was becoming disturbingly thick, and began formal restraining order proceedings that would create legal consequences for further contact. That evening, Tobias found her on the terrace of their shared home. They'd moved in together months ago, combining households with the ease of people who'd thoughtfully considered compatibility rather than rushing into cohabitation for symbolic reasons. "Your mom called me," he said gently, settling into the chair beside her. "Told me what happened. How are you holding up?" "I'm tired," Fila admitted, exhaustion in every syllable. Tired of his obsession, tired of being the object of his redemption fantasy, tired of existing in his narrative instead of just living my own life. The restraining order should help. It should have never gotten this far. He should have respected my first no, my 10th no, my 100th no. But he doesn't hear no, he hears try harder. He hears, I haven't found the right strategy yet. Tobias sat beside her, close enough for comfort, but not crowding her space, respecting her need to process. Some people never learn that you can't love someone into loving you back. That persistence becomes harassment when the other person has clearly declined. He's stuck in a fantasy where his suffering earns him redemption. While I'm just trying to plan a wedding and build a company and live a life that has nothing to do with him. Which you're doing beautifully. They sat in comfortable silence as the evening darkened around them. Inside, wedding invitations waited to be mailed. Invitations Simon would never receive, to a celebration he'd never attend, honoring a partnership he'd never understood how to create. The next day, security protocols at Fila's office were updated with Simon's photo and explicit instructions. The vineyard received the same information, with additional details about the restraining order in progress, with instructions to call police immediately if he appeared. And slowly, finally, his presence began to fade from her daily awareness. The blog posts stopped updating. The last entry dated weeks in the past. The letters stopped arriving. Fridays coming and going without envelopes in her mailbox. Mutual friends reported he'd taken a position in Seattle, far from the professional circles where Fila's reputation continued ascending, far from the constant reminders of what he'd lost. On her wedding day, Fila's phone had 0 calls from him, 0 texts. The silence felt like the actual ending. Not dramatic, just complete, standing in the vineyard's preparation room, wearing a dress she'd chosen for herself, her mother fastening buttons down her back with gentle fingers. Fila realized she'd stopped thinking about Simon entirely. Unless someone brought him up, he'd become irrelevant, not through forgiveness or closure, but through the simple fact that her present was too extraordinary to waste mental space on her past. "Ready?" her mother asked softly. Fila looked at her reflection, confident, radiant, whole. "I've been ready for a long time." Outside, Tobias waited at the altar, not to complete her, but to celebrate her, not to rescue her, but to partner with her, not because she needed him, but because they chose each other, and that choice made from wholeness rather than wounds, made all the difference. Chapter 10. Empire of Two. The morning sun poured through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting golden light across the home Phila and Tobias had built together. Literally built, designing every detail to reflect them both. Phila stood in the kitchen making coffee, barefoot on warm tile, wedding ring catching the light as she moved through the familiar ritual of beginning another day outside. The city sprawled beneath their hillside home, morning fog burning off to reveal downtown towers glittering in early light. Cumulo Solutions now occupied 3 floors of a downtown building, employing nearly 300 people whose talent had been overlooked by systems designed to recognize conventional success. The company had become known for transforming industries through ethical implementation, for proving that profit and principle could coexist, for demonstrating that brilliance came in forms traditional gatekeepers had trained themselves not to see. Tobias emerged from his study, already showered and dressed for morning meetings, reading glasses perched on his nose. He kissed her temple in passing, grabbed his coffee, sat at the counter, reviewing notes. They moved around each other with choreographed ease, neither crowding nor distant, the comfortable rhythm of people who'd learned to occupy shared space without losing individual territory. "Big day," he commented, glancing at her keynote outline spread across the breakfast bar. "Huge day," Phila agreed. The Women in Technology Summit was her platform to announce something she'd been building quietly for months. A $50 million fund for female entrepreneurs who'd been told their vision wasn't worth investment, who'd watched men with half their competence receive 3 times the funding. She'd been one of those women once, pitching ideas while Simon took credit. Never again. "You're going to change lives today," Tobias said, pride evident in his voice. "We're going to change lives," Phila corrected, pulling him close. "Your firm is matching the fund. This is partnership." "That's the difference," he agreed, understanding exactly what she meant. Preparing for the summit, Phila caught her reflection in the hallway mirror, tailored suit that commanded attention, confidence earned through surviving what should have destroyed her. She thought briefly about that moment in the shopping complex, automatic doors opening on truth she couldn't unsee. Those doors hadn't just revealed Simon's betrayal. They'd opened onto the life she was always meant to build. She heard about Simon occasionally. Through industry grapevine, he'd remarried someone in Seattle, worked steady project management, lived an ordinary life. She felt nothing about it. Not satisfaction, not vindication, not even curiosity. Backstage, the summit coordinator ran through final logistics. 3,000 women filing in, voices creating anticipation and community. Tobias found her in the wings. "You're going to be magnificent." "I'm terrified," she admitted. "Good. Fear means it matters." He squeezed her hand once, then stepped back. The introduction began. Phila listened to her accomplishments recited. Company growth, innovative frameworks, industry recognition, feeling strange hearing her journey summarized when she knew every sacrifice those achievements represented. Then she walked onto the stage. 3,000 women rose in welcome. Phila felt the energy, the hunger for validation that their struggles weren't personal failures but systemic barriers. She began speaking. "Someone once asked me how I rebuilt after losing everything. I told them I didn't lose everything. I lost the illusion that I needed someone else's permission to be extraordinary." The audience leaned in. "The revenge isn't making him regret losing you," Phila continued. "The revenge is building something so magnificent that his presence in your past becomes a footnote you rarely remember to mention." She announced the fund, $50 million for women whose ideas had been dismissed. The crowd rose in ovation. In the wings, Tobias watched with quiet pride. Not because she was his, but because she was hers. Fully, completely, unapologetically herself. Somewhere in Seattle, Simon saw the live stream trending. He watched for 30 seconds before closing the laptop. Some doors, once you walk through them in the wrong direction, never open again. Fila had learned that lesson standing before automatic doors. Simon never learned it, and that made all the difference. After the summit, after networking and celebration, Fila and Tobias drove home through evening traffic. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Complete," she said simply. "Not because everything is perfect, but because I finally understand that I don't need permission to be who I am." They climbed the hill toward home, city lights flickering on beneath them. Inside, they made dinner together, chopping vegetables and debating seasoning, ordinary intimacy of people who'd chosen partnership over performance. That night, lying in bed with Tobias's breathing steady beside her, Fila realized she couldn't remember the last time she'd thought about Simon without external prompting. The automatic doors had opened. She'd walked through into truth. And what remained? This life, this partnership, this unapologetic brilliance, was everything she'd been too afraid to claim when she was busy trying to be enough for someone who would never think anyone was enough. Outside, the city slept. Inside, Fila finally did too, dreamless, peaceful, whole. The empire she'd built wasn't conquest or revenge. It was freedom, and that was the greatest victory of all.